I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased to be inaugurating our fall Bay Area Latin America Forum. The issue of drug violence in Mexico is both traumatic and intractable. It is a critical issue for the country. It is a critical issue for the relationship of Mexico and the United States. It has many implications. And we're particularly pleased to have with us Beatriz Magaloni to speak about this. Beatriz Magaloni is a professor of political science at Stanford. She's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. She's written widely and in a very insightful way about this issue, as well as many other issues. She will give a presentation, and then we look forward to comments, discussion, and questions afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Beatriz Magaloni.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those kind words and the invitation to talk today. I'm very excited to be here at Berkeley talking again. I think it's been like 2 years that I was here. And I'm going to be talking about our work on drug violence. This is joint work with Gabriela Calderón, Gustavo Robles, and Alberto Diaz, whose name doesn't appear down there. We also have, the work I'm going to be talking about today specifically focuses on the government interventions to combat criminal organizations followed by President Calderón during the last presidential term. And what we are going to try to assess here is the effects of some of those interventions on the dynamics and escalation of violence in Mexico. But we have been working on the issue of violence over the course of the last 3 years already. We have some joint work with Ayla, who is here, on extortion and the dynamics of it in Mexico. We have conducted some very interesting surveys looking at that part, and we also have done some work on the consequences of violence, looking at the economic consequences of violence, trying to measure how much it has impacted growth in addition to other variables. And also the latest work I'm doing looks at education and how it's impacting kids at school. So we're really working a lot on this issue as, as you mentioned, it's a very important issue for not only Mexico, but Latin America in general. So what I'm going to be focusing here is on, as I say, the interventions. And so drug wars have received very little attention, I think, in the extensive body of scholarly literature focusing on violence. And here I borrow from Lessing's work, who is a graduate PhD from here. Wonderful work, and he says, unlike insurgents, drug cartels do not seek to supplant the state or stake secessionist claims, and that really sort of sets them apart in terms of the dynamics of violence and the strategies that they follow and what's the consequences of their actions. And some of the work that is now developing including Lessing's own work and our own work and other work by Ayla and others, is trying to really piece out what is the dynamics of this war, drug wars. So cartels, as was mentioned, impose very serious human and economic costs, and are very serious threats to national security. So we really need to start understanding better, what's the logic of these wars. The outline of the presentation would be, I first would describe the geography of violence in Mexico. Then I would put the issue that I'm studying in the wider context and possible causes of this escalation of violence, including in some possible international and domestic factors, in addition to the government policies that I'm going to be talking about. Then I will focus on the consequences of government interventions on violence, and that part of the presentation is mostly about an empirical strategy to try to measure those interventions, specifically focusing on the beheading strategy that I will show really sets Calderón apart from other administrations. And then I would conclude. Okay, so this is just the first look at how much violence increased during the Calderón administration. The red area means executions among criminal organizations. The blue area is confrontations between the state and the cartels. And the green area are general homicides that cannot be classified as related to drugs. This data was collected by several agencies and disseminated by the Mexican presidency, and actually they now stopped producing this data. There is big controversy in Mexico about that, because during the current administration there has been like an emphasis in not talking about violence, to shift attention. And this data set, which was actually very good for scholars and analysts and NGOs on the ground, is no longer available. But what you can see is that there is a dramatic increase in the violence in Mexico, and that really more or less coincides with the beginnings of the administration of Calderón. So the question is really what happened in those years. What's the relationship between is there a relationship between these policies and the escalation of violence, and whether we can really tease it out? And this is the topic of our paper. To give you a sense of the geographic dispersion of the violence, this is homicide rates in 2007, and the red areas are the most violent places in Mexico. At the beginning, you see a few spots that are very violent. You know, the usual places: Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, Culiacán, where the drug business was born. This is the area of Sinaloa, where the cartels were really born more than 100 years ago, and then Acapulco, and then the violence starts to spread. And by 2009, it becomes a serious problem in many areas of the country, although still concentrated. With some logic that I will show in the further slides of the presentation. So there is a general spread in violence. There is more intensity in violence. Seems to be spreading across the country, although there are some areas where you don't observe violence at all. And so what we want to really understand is the impact of the government interventions on those. Just before I start talking about those interventions, I just want to show that there is a fragmentation of the drug cartels that is very unique to Mexico, at least distinct to what has happened in Colombia. So as time has gone by, there is increasingly more and more cartels emerging. Although now we have a lot of cartels, there is also concentration of power in two cartels, the Zetas versus the Sinaloa cartel today, but there is fragmentation going on. And that complicates the problem. So what are the possible causes of this increase in violence? As you say, 2007 is the dramatic increase. So one of the factors that has changed in Mexico, obviously, is that there is significantly more trade with the United States. And as you know, the drugs come to the U.S. Hidden in legal merchandise. So the more Mexico trades with the U.S., the easier it is to bring drugs into this country. So cartels are really profiting from that increase in trade with the U.S. Then there was a very strong set of policies in the U.S. to try to block the route coming from Colombia through the Caribbean. And that really created incentives for the drugs to start shifting to Mexico. Then there is a very interesting paper by Mejia and Castillo showing that in 2007, Colombia changed its policies. And it was significantly more successful at seizing drugs and shifting the policies from eradication to seizure of drugs. And that, according to him, and he has a very interesting paper. I'll show you some graphs showing here. So this is well, I can barely read here right now, but this is the correlation between the violence in Mexico. I think it's the red one, and the seizures that are happening in Colombia. So he takes this and then interacts this time series with the distance of the municipalities in Mexico to the border, and shows that that's a quite good predictor for increases in violence in Mexico. So there is clearly exogenous factors that are shaping the increase in violence. I think this paper does a nice job at showing that, but there is probably also other policies that have impacted, and this is what we are going to try to show. Then there is other work that argues that democratization has played a very important role in increasing the violence in Mexico. Although democratization, as you know, happened in the earlier 90s, and in 2000, and the violence increases in 2006. So there is not a clear correlation between that, but there is a significantly different institutional structure that actually shapes the way cartels behave in Mexico. So before the PRI, as you know, dominated national power, and there was only a single organization, political organization, that the cartels had to negotiate with. and that normally was at the top with the president and a few players from the army, from the procuradurías and so on, but it was really fewer players that were offerings or suppliers of institutional protection. So the price was very high because there were few players, but now as Mexico democratized, there are a lot of different parties at the local level, different politicians responding to different interests, and all of those are possible suppliers of institutional protection. So as you get more supply for institutional protection on the part of the government, the price for the cartels reduces significantly. And I think that what really happens in Mexico is that the cost to entry are very low because of this political fragmentation. So this needs to be taken into account as a facilitating factor for the things that we are observing, okay? So as I say, we are going to be focusing on this paper on the policies, and there are 4 policies that the government followed. Seizures of vehicles, money, drugs, and arms, eradication of marijuana poppy crops and the destruction of meth labs, arrest of leaders and lieutenants, and joint operations. These are the set of policies that Calderón followed, but the policies didn't really differ significantly in the first 2 policies didn't really differ significantly for previous administrations. These are seizures of marijuana and cocaine divided by administrations, and as you can see, for example, in the case of cocaine, there is he sees less than the previous administrations. In the case of marijuana, he just doesn't distance himself very much from previous administrations. Here is the same eradication, not seizure, but eradication, and here actually you find less than what happened in previous administrations. So Calderón doesn't really distinguish himself so much on the ground of these actions, although there is more. Here is a very significant increase of heroin seizures. But this is arms. There is a student of mine is doing a paper on these arms seizures. Obviously, that changed a lot. Anyway, there are 2 policies that really mark him apart. One is the sending of the army and the Navy to the streets in Mexico to fight the cartels. So during his administration, there were 9 joint operations, which in practice meant that the army arrived to the states to assume responsibilities of law enforcement in coordination with the local government, sometimes not so well coordinated, and then also with the participation of the federal police. Unfortunately, we don't have the data on specifically where we know the states and the date more or less in which they intervene, but there is not enough information for us to be able to tease the participation of the army and how much that has impacted violence, because we don't have that data. We asked for the data. We have some interesting data that is on arrest, but not on this. So it's really not possible for us to do that type of analysis. And we have done some work doing some matching of the states in which he intervened and trying to see whether you see with this matching technology, some methodologies, some evidence that there is sort of a significant increase in violence once the army arrives. And you find a very significant increase, but we're not confident of the results, unfortunately, because the matching is just very rude at that level. But we're able to do something very different with the arrest of leaders. So this is the list that actually they released, the government released in 2007, and they say these are the 37 most wanted individuals in Mexico, the kingpins. And by 2011, they had put in jail or killed all these, cartel leaders. So there is a very serious attempt to target and combat the criminal organizations by arresting their top leaders and lieutenants, and that we can use to do some analysis. So that's exactly what we use. We are able to map the interventions in the moment in which they take place and in the different localities on when a leader or a lieutenant was arrested. I'm sorry for the small, I didn't notice that when I put it together in this. But you see the different cartels of, for example, the Arellano Felix organization, the Beltran Leiva, the Juarez Cartel, La Familia, the Golfs and the Zetas. Here they are together because they split later on when a lot of these arrests were happening, they were part of the same organization. Then Pacific and the Sinaloa Cartel, and then I don't know what it says there. Sorry about that. I cannot even read it. Diaz Parada, and then undefined organization. Okay, and then we have the lieutenants and the leaders. So it's 125 lieutenants. Lieutenants are the sort of the territorial agents of the cartels. They are in charge of of controlling the plazas, of controlling the local criminal cells, of making the deals with the politicians on the ground, and also of taxing the other criminal organizations that pass through their territory. So they're really the main operators of the cartels in the territory. And the kingpins are the ones who coordinate the entire organizations. We don't know really very much about the industrial organizations of these terrorist groups, but that's, you know, that's what we know, that they are quite decentralized on the one hand, that there is a lot of territorial agents operating that control the criminal cells, and sometimes the criminal cells are really working very much independently from the cartels. Okay, so focusing on these interventions and the government interventions, there is now a quite extensive body of literature, mostly by Mexicans, although there is Ben Lessing's work here and Melissa Dell's at Harvard, who has also reflected a little bit on these issues. And in general, Guerrero it's a very strong critique to these government interventions. He has claimed that in his view, the main culprit for the fragmentation of the cartels and the increasing violence in Mexico during the Calderón administration is because of the arrests. And then Martinez and Poiré, as you know, Poiré was the former interior minister. They responded to their article saying that there is huge endogeneity problem, so obviously the government intervenes and arrests kingpins and lieutenants when there are already factions happening within the criminal organizations in the locality. So, for example, one of the things that might happen is that if there are ruptures in the organization, one of the factions might supply information to the government, drawing the government in the conflict, and then asking the government to arrest their enemies. So there is obviously a huge problem of indigeneity that none of these articles solve. The problem is that obviously you are going to have more interventions where you have more divisions and possibly where violence is escalating. So it's very tricky to model this, and none of these works are able to solve the problem of identification, and it's a complicated problem to solve. Ben Lessing work, which I really like very much, he focuses mostly on violence between the state and the cartels, and is not really looking at this turf war violence that we are right now looking at. But obviously, his work relates to what we're doing in that he looks at government interventions because it's cartel-state confrontations. And he argues that in a situation like Calderón did, where you are targeting all the cartels at the same time without really making conditional interventions conditional on, for example, reducing violence or targeting specific organizations, that according to him, the interventions are not going to be successful. And then Dell's work, it's, I think, the first attempt to really solve the problem of identification. And she uses a very clever strategy looking at municipalities that have been won at the margin, and with a possible idea that when PAN wins at the margin, it's going to be easier for Calderón in that moment to intervene. So a PAN win for her means that the government is really intervening locally, and she finds that there is an increase in violence on those places that are won at the margin by the PAN. Problem with her approach is that she doesn't really have a measure of intervention. So if the PAN wins even, sort of by the margin, it might not be the case that they perform those actions in that locality. It might even be the case that PAN wins, with very narrow margins. It could be that the government is really weak in that locality because it just won so narrowly that the intervention might not happen. So the problem with her approach is that it really doesn't measure government interventions. And this is what we're going to try to do here, okay? So why would arrest increase violence? And then I think that the logic is the following. So one possibility is that you go and arrest someone in a locality, and then the space is open for other members of the criminal organization to try to occupy that leadership position. So there is fights within the organization for the leadership of that locality. Then another possibility, which is really the most disturbing one, is that the state action can have a paradoxical effect in that the state intervenes against that cartel, and then necessarily it weakens that cartel. But there are other cartels competing in Mexico who would really take that as an opportunity to invade territory because they want to dispute that territory because it's valuable for the trafficking of drugs. So this is because of the logic of turf wars, that cartels are fighting for territory that allows them to traffic drugs and to tax other organizations that pass their drugs through their territory. So that's the paradoxical effect of interventions, and that's, I think, we have some very strong evidence suggesting that that happens. And then the third possibility, which we also show happens, is that once the local leader gets arrested, there is a lot of criminal cells that are operating locally with that cartel. And the problem is that when the leader gets arrested, the criminal cells might really go loose. One possibility is that they are no longer able to engage with drug trafficking because that requires coordination with the cartel, and so they start engaging in criminal acts against the population, like extortion or kidnapping or diversifying their portfolio of criminal activity. And so that might be another externality of these arrests, and we also find evidence that that is happening. Obviously, this argument presupposes that the leaders really want to restrain their criminal cells at, committing these acts against the population. And we have some evidence that that happens. There is a very interesting case study of the Felix organization, Arellano Felix organization in Tijuana, which had a division, and one faction wanted to only concentrate on drug trafficking, and the other faction was really starting to engage in extortion. And the factions fought because the faction that wanted to concentrate only on drug trafficking thought that if you engage in extortion and kidnapping, you are going to attract the attention of the government, and then that's going to hurt the local business. They actually fought a war after the faction won, the kidnappings started to decrease. So there is some evidence that cartel leaders might restrain their criminal cells, although we don't have many narratives about this. Okay, so we also might expect differences in terms of capturing leaders and lieutenants, and since we have that variation in our data, we might want to see whether there is. So in theory, I think lieutenants should have more of a local impact in terms of if you arrest a lieutenant who is really in charge of that, the organization operating on the ground there, you are going to see more impact. That's presumably the case. So we were really thinking, okay, what happens? Because our data really looks at local effects, as I will be able to show. So why would capturing a leader shape violence locally? It was not so clear for me at the beginning, and then the more and more we work on this, the more I think we start to understand there are maybe three possibilities. One is that there is revenge. So let's say a leader gets arrested in a municipality in Michoacán. So the cartel suspects that there is local informants that supply the information to the government and enable the arrest. So one possibility is that there is a lot of revenge happening after the arrest takes place. They go and kill the informants. The other thing that I think happens when the arrest of the leader takes place is that the local leader is also suspected of having cooperated with the authorities or having cooperated with a rival organization. So necessarily the local leader where the arrest happens also weakens. And so if the local leader weakens, then we start to see all the things that we have just talked about, that there is going to be leadership fights within that territory, and then there is also a weakening of the chain of command in that territory, and criminal cells might become loose. So we expect similar effects actually between leaders and lieutenants. The only difference is that I think leaders are going to have a wider impact on the broader area of influence of the cartel and not exclusively on those localities. And the moment we have not been able to assess that because we don't have the data to map the area of influence, but there is some possibilities to construct that, and I'll talk about that later. So this is the data that we are going to be using to do our empirical analysis. And I'm sorry, I didn't notice the graphs were so little when I paste them, but what I told you that there is this government data that classifies the information for those periods, the 4 or 5 years during the Calderón, and we know which of the violence is drug-related. But we really want to work with longer time trends. So what we did is we went back to the death certificates of the Sinais. These are collected for the entire country, and we have really a long time series that goes all the way back right now actually to the 1980s. So we really could work with a very long time series. But we want to know of those homicides which are related to, possibly related to drug trafficking and which are general homicides. So what we do is take the trend of the government data and match it to all these different age cohorts for the CNIS data. And we are able to see that the population between 15 and 39 years, and actually it's not only male population, it's that population matches most closely the data for the government related, DTO-related deaths. So we are going to be taking that, age group as a proxy for drug-related homicides, and the rest of the homicides is just the homicides against the general population. All of our analysis was also performed with the government's data, and almost all the results hold the same. So this is, I think, a good approximation for the homicides. So we are going to be looking again at drug-related homicides and homicides against the general population. And we're going to be able to see whether the interventions shape those patterns in the data. And this is the groups of municipalities which we are going to be looking for treatment effects. So first is the treated municipalities. That's where the arrest of a leader or a lieutenant takes place. Then we are going to be looking at neighboring municipalities, which is the yellow municipalities. If the leader is arrested there, the violence might spread to those places. So we could also do neighboring effects that are a little bigger, but for the moment we're focusing on neighboring effects in that way. And then we're going to be looking at these interesting yellow parts that this doesn't appear here, but it's what we call neighboring strategic municipalities. And this is something that follows from this data. So we are able to take the entire territory of Mexico and then locate in Mexico the border crossing, where the puertos, how do you say this? Puertos. Ports. The ports, the airports, the airstrips where small airplanes land, the train freight, and the places where the train crosses and they change freight. And basically, yes, and highways that are 4-lane highways. And if you look, we're assuming here, just that you are able to see this more closely, that the violence really doesn't spread just randomly in Mexico. And I think this is a contribution of our paper in relation to what, for example, Guerrero says, that the violence is spreading really randomly. The violence really focuses mostly on these places that are worth fighting for, because the drug traffickers really have benefit of controlling this territory. Why? Because one, is easier to traffic drugs if you control an airport or a road that goes to the U.S. But also, importantly, because drugs from other organizations pass through those points, and then you can tax them and extort them. So a lot of the the money, that the profits that they make also come from extorting other criminal organizations. So we are going to be focusing on diffusion effects to these points. Okay, so the empirical strategy, I'm not going to really talk too much about the details of the strategy, but we follow two strategies. As I say, we have a problem with reverse causality, endogeneity, omitted variable, and the fact that the government tends to intervene in places that are different. So we worry about that, and we are going to follow two strategies. The first one is a difference in difference strategy, only restricting our analysis to those treated municipalities, with the assumption that these treated municipalities are similar in omitted and unomitted characteristics. And this is really just a very simple difference in difference before and after, with all sorts of controls, fixed effects, time trend effects, and so on. So this is the simplest way to look at this, but we also wanted to see, obviously, whether we are really trying to, we are doing some good job at solving this problem. So we build on this synthetic control methodology, in which what we are doing is really constructing, it's like a matching technology, but what we're really doing here is looking at the homicide trends of all the municipalities in this long time period that I explained, and we're going to try to match the municipalities that look very, very similar to the ones that we observe treatment in. And this is a methodology that I always have problem pronouncing. Abadi and Gardezabal and Abadi, Diamond, and Hay-Muller developed, trying to understand. In one of their papers, actually, is the impact of violence on economic performance. This is in Spain. But so we follow this methodology. And I'm not going to be, so what really we do is construct with this methodology a synthetic control group with which we can compare the treated municipalities with, okay? And I can show you at the end. I didn't bring it it's at the end of my presentation, how the trends look, and we are sort of confident that we are matching correctly. And so what I'm going to be presented here is this is the subsample for interventions by leaders, and I'm sorry it doesn't look well from the distance. This is the subsample of treatment of lieutenant's arrest, and this is the full sample with the synthetic control. So here we are focusing on fewer number of municipalities than here, okay? And this is, across time again. So what we find is that there is a very strong effect of capturing a leader. Here, this is with the difference in difference, and a lieutenant as well on the first 6 months after the arrest takes place, and this is quite strong. So, for example, there is an increase of 40% of homicides happening, and this is using the DTO-related violence. Okay, so homicides among the DTOs are increasing by 40%. This is the subsample for lieutenants, and we find a similar effect with the synthetic controls. So we're more or less confident that this effect takes place. And then I'm going to go very quickly with the rest of the results because there's too many tables. So the other result that we find is that there is not so much of an evidence that homicides against the general population increase in the municipality where the arrest takes place, but we have very strong evidence that they increase in the neighboring municipalities after the leader is arrested. So there is evidence that Mexico is experiencing more homicides as a result of this arrests that are not necessarily related only among the criminal organizations. And the last result, which I think is very interesting, it's again with this is the entire data is run with synthetic weights, and we run here with the Sinai's data, the government data, and the homicides against the general population. So we have our proxy for DTO violence, the government data for DTO violence, and this is the violence against the general population. And then what this does is the same thing, looking at the effects for treatment the first 6 months and the following 6 months for arrest of leaders and lieutenants. But here we interact for the neighboring effects, the strategic points that we mentioned that I mentioned and that I mapped. And what we find is that most of the spillover effects for the violence that is related to DTO happens in these strategic points. So when a lieutenant is captured in the first 6 months, there is a significant increase of violence, that 48%, and then 61% increase. This is DTO-related violence, and then there is also an increase in violence against the general population that happens in these strategic points. Again, when a lieutenant is captured, although there is also evidence that when a leader is captured, there is a spread of violence in these strategic points. So to conclude the analysis, we find very strong evidence that there is an increase of violence in the treated municipality, both when leaders and lieutenants get arrested. This is a short-term increase in violence of significant increases of 40 or more percent. You have to really be mindful of how to calculate this, and we have calculated the number of dead people, but I don't like to present that information in that way. But you have to really take into account in each municipality how many people are dying, and then the 48% might really mean 3 more deaths per month. So it's not really but that's what we are finding, no? Depending on how violent the municipality is. And this is, for 6 months in the case of DTO, in the first. So we find evidence that when the leader is captured, homicides against the general population also increase. And this to me is worrisome because it means that there is more kidnapping, more extortion happening in Mexico, and in part as a result of these interventions. And then the spillover effects, I think it's interesting what we found, because it doesn't seem to be that the violence just spills, at least DTO violence spills randomly, that it seems to concentrate more on these neighboring municipalities that are also strategic points. So it's not the case that wherever you arrest, there is going to be more violence. So the spread is going to happen where DTOs really have an interest in fighting for valuable territories that are really worth fighting for. Okay, so let me just put broader context of the presentation, and it's the following, just 3 things. One is that there is some evidence showing that arresting leaders of terrorist organizations and rebel groups works. So what is different from DTOs? And so the paper that we just finished tries to look at these differences. And I think that there are 2 very important differences here. Obviously the profit motive is one difference, but especially the last one I think is critical, that DTOs face competition from other DTOs. So the main enemy of the DTOs not necessarily is the state, but they are the enemies who want to control territory. So interventions of the state really have to be measured as, I'm going to intervene against this cartel and this other cartel is going to invade territory. That competition doesn't necessarily happen in the same way with terrorist or rebel groups. And the last reflection is really about Colombia versus Mexico. And this is just more broadly speaking, not necessarily to what we find, because as you saw, we found very strong effects in Mexico. But in Colombia, the policies seem to have worked differently. Obviously, there is debate of whether they work or not, but at least the decapitation strategy, which what followed, didn't really seem to create this type of sort of Hydra effect that we observed in Mexico. And I think that we have to take into account 3 things to understand the differences, the last one being the most important. One is the decentralized structure of Mexican cartels. In Colombia, the Medellin cartel at least was very hierarchical, centered around Pablo Escobar, not really these type of organizations that we observed in Mexico with all these criminal cells operating locally in a very decentralized fashion. Second is the competitive structure of the market in Mexico. Never in Colombia were there so many cartels competing. And the third one, which I think is very important, is that relates to the argument of democratization I mentioned first, is that Mexico has a politically fragmented federal system that really lowers entry costs for local criminal organizations. And Colombia has a very different structure, national, more centralized, that doesn't really have this type of political fragmentation. And I think the policies have to be put in this context. They can have different effects in different places. And that's where I want to leave the presentation. Thank you.
Or would you prefer to recognize people yourself?
It's okay, I can recognize, or you know them by name, maybe you can have, no? Okay. So I will try to do my best to, yes. Thank you.
So we're going to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
Vicente Fox has been visiting the U.S. lately and running around with an organization called NORMA, which is to medicalize or legalize marijuana. What's he doing, and how do people look at that?
I think this is really starting to change, fortunately, all over Latin America. This, that there has to be a different approach to this problem. I think as long as drugs remain illegal in the way they are, and the demand for them is so huge in the United States, it's going to be very hard for to combat this violence. The interesting, when you start to look at public opinion, people, vary. I mean, people in Mexico are suffering so much from the violence, but if you ask, do you want to legalize drugs, they don't necessarily recognize the linkage between one and the other. So I think this is very tricky, and also within the US, I don't think that people recognize that linkage either. So something that I would say, people have to start going to public high schools and middle schools and present this type of data and see, the externalities of drug consumption as the way, I'm not talking, drug consumption, of the way drugs are sort of the legal structure of the illegal nature of drugs here in the United States and in our countries. But I don't think that the public has that awareness. That's my impression. There is not that much awareness of this link.
So I wanted to ask about the decentralization of cartels in Mexico. And so you said something earlier in the talk about decentralization lowering entry costs for cartels, which you then returned to at the end. So one thing I wondered, could you talk a little bit more about the logic of that? On the one hand, it might be that local mayors can provide protection to cartels locally. but the cartels are operating across large swaths of land.
Yes.
They're protecting turf and routes that often extend beyond, and particularly as they've grown, extend beyond even local regions like Sinaloa. So I was wondering how the structure of political competition or the number of authorities at the central and national
Yes.
at the national and local levels shape those entry costs. So if you could say a little bit more about that, and then maybe relate that a bit to Guillermo Trejo's argument about political competition, which I was
Yes.
thinking about as you talked, because what I understand him to say is that it's really the destruction of the PRI and the entry of the PAN at the local level that in many ways produced the explosion of violence. So
Yes.
in what ways is that consistent with your argument, or is that a different argument?
So it's very interesting how to show empirically this argument, because if you look at homicide trends during the last 20 years, and Ayla is very aware of this because we're working together on this paper, you see that the homicides are decreasing systematically and in an amazing way during the period in which Mexico is democratizing, which is the 90s. So it's not the case that you can do an analysis of alternation. There is no way you can show that. So in that period, the homicides are decreasing. And it's really something that is actually not that well known. But if you just look at the trend, I mean, with this data we have, the 80s were almost as violent as what we see now. No? And then democratization in the 90s, really you see a lot of decreasing homicides. And the increase of homicides really happens in 2007. So there is no way around trying to address Calderón's policies or what happened in Colombia, let's say Mejia's argument. For that trend of 2007, the increase. So I don't think that it's a secular process. It's something of an intervention that happens and that really, the argument I'm making is that the intervention interacts with the fragmentation. No? So a similar intervention in Colombia might not lead to the same type of explosion of violence in Mexico. To be able to prove that argument, I would need a lot of countries, no? But I just think that just trying to reflect on what is different between Colombia and Mexico, I go to that. And so going back to the first point of your question, so think of how it worked in the past. Obviously, we have very little information exactly how this worked, but we know that there was sort of an implicit agreement of tolerance with the PRI that was negotiated at the highest levels. There is a lot of scandals of corruption that happened, during the Salinas administration, and there is a lot of sort of evidence, journalistic evidence supporting the fact that there was a lot of sort of deals done at the top with the drug traffickers. They have been operating there for many years. No? So what changed? And I really think the alternation of power matters, both presidential alternation, that's really important. So it's not really democratization at the local level, a change of approach at the top, and then the fragmentation at the bottom. So what happens is that before you had to negotiate with Salinas himself to be able to operate on the corridor of the Northwest. No? And so there were very few cartels, and negotiating at the top is expensive. So you have to be able to have those connections. But now you have, okay, I can negotiate with the governor of Sinaloa. I can negotiate with because you really need to control the space locally. So that's what I referred to. So it's easier to negotiate at that level. There is a lot of supply of that protection that is needed. And before it was hard to, it was hard to have a deal if you were the governor of Sinaloa without Salinas knowing or de la Madrid knowing at the same time. So that's what I think happened. But obviously we cannot test this, not with the empirical. Yes.
Can I just
Yes.
follow
Yes.
on to that? So, how would you distinguish two things?
Yes.
One is democratization
Yes.
versus decentralization.
That's right. Yes.
And the other is alternation with just change in policy. Because
Yes.
obviously two presidents could have very different policies.
That's right.
And,
Yes.
and in terms of the decentralization, are you specifically, there could be levels of different levels of decentralization also under the PRI.
Yes. Yes.
But is there something, obviously partisan alignment is sometimes,
Yes.
but do you have specific evidence of partisan alignment as opposed to just decentralization?
Yes,
So separating
great
out
question.
those two things.
Yes.
sort of democratization,
Yes.
and decentralization, and policy change and alternation?
That's a wonderful question. So the problem in Mexico, everything is changing sort of at the same time, but I think we can leverage some variation at the local level to try to piece those arguments together. So in Mexico, authoritarianism meant centralization because of the way the PRI was structured. No? So a lot of power was centered on the presidency, and that, you know, the presidency was really the a key political player, no? Despite the fact that we had federalism. So when the PRI loses the control of the presidency, that sort of form of dealing with the governors and the center completely changes. So governors, in a way, go on their own. No? PRI governors at the same time as, you know, PAN governors. No? So that is something that I think it's very hard to distinguish in Mexico because both go together. But just talking about policy and alignment of sort of politicians, so a paper that Gustavo, who is my co-author here, is writing is on arms issues, and he's able to show that where you have similar politicians locally, there is more arms issues happening. So in fact, you know, Dell's intuition is correct in a way, that yes, you have policies coming from Calderón and the same party in the locality, those two make interventions happen against the cartels, no? So in that sense, it's alignment of interest there and of policy, no? But interestingly, in his approach, it's really about the governorship, and it's not really about the municipal presence. So the key player seems to be the governor in the locality. And lastly, is it policy or not? So let's say, and I think we can use Fox here, no? So there was a change of party, but Fox didn't really change much the policies. I think, I mean, there is some evidence, some anecdotal evidence saying that he really feared this. He really said, mejor no lo toques, no? This is really, so he just didn't want to do what Calderón did. So obviously policy mattered a lot, no? So this is, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we can leverage variation in this, you know, different periods to try to piece out how each of them is impacting in Mexico. Yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think Calderón was saying in Harvard that he said that he changed from narcotráfico to narcomenudeo in Mexico, and I was wondering if there's
Yes.
Evidence that all this disarray of all this violence created some sort of, did it stop the flow of drugs to the U.S., or is there any evidence of that, or it just remained the same way and all these people died for basically nothing?
That's a very good question. I think there is some evidence showing that the price has slightly changed of, you know, cocaine in the U.S. No, and this is a debate. I mean, I really think a lot of people are placing more emphasis on the violence being, you know, fed by local business in Mexico. No, I really think that, you know, if you see the map that we showed there, this map would really question that. I mean. And then I didn't bring the entire map, but it's equally striking. I just think that if, you know, there is a clear connection to me between what comes to the US and where the violence concentrates. And that really suggests that cartels are fighting for what is really most valuable, which is bringing the drugs here, despite the fact that there has been increases in consumption in Mexico. But I think those are really peanuts compared to what they really get for, you know, for bringing drugs here. But I know there is debate among, you know, I know Calderón likes this. There is also some work by Diana Rios, you know, focusing on drug consumption. I just don't think that's really what is driving most of the violence. And this really shows very clearly. And we ran up, you know, interestingly, it's not the place to present, but we have you know, another paper just showing the basic correlates of violence in Mexico, controlling for poverty, controlling for, you know, urbanization, lots of really different variables that, you know, somehow should be correlated, no? And these consistently show in all the regressions, controlling again for urbanization, for, you know, this, what we call the strategic points. And also it's interesting, it suggests our results that, for example, the airstrips, at the beginning were not so valuable, and then they became more valuable in the last 3 years. So, you know, it seems also that it shifts. Let's say the government puts more emphasis on blocking drugs here, so they are going to find other ways, no? And so, for example, first it was mostly border crossings, but now it's really, you know, it's profitable to have places where you can land planes, no? and so that would be my answer. I think it's mostly about drugs to the U.S. Yes.
So I guess kind of returning to the legalization
yes.
of marijuana question. So say the U.S., the whole U.S. were to adopt a policy of legalization of marijuana, what percent of the drug trafficking is marijuana, and how do you think that would affect the roots of the violence?
So very good question. The evidence suggests that in terms of bulk, most is marijuana, but in terms of value, it's really more about cocaine. And so I don't know whether if you do an intervention only on marijuana, which is, I don't think is going to, happen in the short term, whether that would really impact the entire chain. No? And really, to tell you the truth, I doubt it. I think that as long as it remains illegal, it's going to happen. And so the best strategy for me would be to take this as a medical problem. Because, saying legalization of drugs is not saying it's great to have drugs in the streets, but it's really dealing with it in a very different way. And again, this requires a very different approach, changing perception among the U.S. public and the politicians, and, but I think it's urgent to start to have these debates because Mexico is obviously suffering a lot because of this violence. But if you look at Central America, it's just going to the drain. No, I think it's a very urgent debate, and I see that there is some sort of movement in Latin America to start talking about this more. But Calderón never wanted to talk about this until the end, actually until he left and maybe acknowledging, yes, this is not really the way to go. So the question is what to do, and this is really very tricky. I don't have the answer. I just think that by treating this, like a war, is not going to work. This is what I can tell. I mean, even if it were well-intentioned policies, which I really have no way of knowing, the externalities are huge, and we didn't really talk about other externalities, which is, I'm sure you've heard of this, but huge increases in human rights violations. I mean, really serious misconduct on the part of the institutions that were supposed to be, fighting the drug cartel. So clearly that approach is not working and is not going to work. But I don't have what is it that you need to do to. So now we are working on kids in schools and how to do interventions that maybe, sort of allow them to follow a different path, route in poor neighborhoods. So we have a couple of projects of those, one in Jalisco. And then I think Brazil has done an amazing, different approach in the favelas, which I'm also working on. Although, I've been going to Brazil for 4 times already. I'm going in a couple of weeks. I'm really fascinated by what is happening, but the situation is very complicated still. I mean, it's not, yes, the pacification is working, but it still is really difficult. And you go underground, there is a lot of things going on. The politicians, especially the police, really divided. Some of them want to reverse the approach. And really what is happening there is that they decided it's going to be about violence and it's not going to be about drugs. So let's control the violence. Drugs are going to still, as long as they move around without violence. Whether that can happen, I mean, think of it. I really seriously don't know. That's the approach they want to follow in Brazil, and I hope it works. But I don't know if it is possible, because as long as these are illegal organizations with so much power, they're still going to be able to disrupt, anything if they want. So I prefer the Brazilian approach so much better. But as I say, it's not really bulletproof either. Yes?
I don't know if you have looked not only at the drug war policies, but at the drug war politics.
Yes.
Calderón,
interesting.
Since the first day of his administration, was looking at very specific places in the country, and politics were running over the country. And the second is that a lot of officials, local officials, were killed. Not only the police, but a lot of mayors and public servants that were killed during this period, and it influences a lot on local politics.
Yes.
So the drug cartels were not only looking to fight against
Yes.
the power, but they want to take the power now, and they are
Yes.
influencing a lot of local authorities and state authorities.
Yes.
And last federal election was very highly questioned because of the interest of the drug cartels in the election.
That's right.
So I don't know how you have related one to the other.
Yes. So, the only thing, obviously there's a lot to still be, explore on these questions. And as I say, I have no clear answers because, for example, after the paper you would say, okay, these interventions are really lousy. No, don't do it this way. But then you speak with people on the ground, which we have done. So let's say in the worst days of violence in Tamaulipas, no? Some people I know I've been talking with, ask me, please do not reveal my name. Do not reveal any, because, family were kidnapped, were extorted. But they were saying really they were desperate. They knew that the, local government was controlled by the, by the criminal organizations locally, and they were really suffering. So in those localities, and we have a paper showing how much this violence impacted the elections in Mexico, no? So if you really just superficially read this, okay, Calderón lost because of this, no? But then if you start doing the microanalysis of this, it happens, to be the case, which is a really interesting finding, that violence controlling, seems to affect more PRI than PAN. And really you start to map the violence, and then you start to see that the most corrupt governors are really, or the most violent places are locally controlled by PRI. So it's not trivial, and so what do you do? I really just, obviously you cannot just say, okay, I don't do anything and just suffer the violence. Your local government is captured by the drug gangs, and people don't do anything. I don't think that's the strategy, really, if you're the federal government, but clearly the strategy didn't work. So something needs to be seriously changed. The problem, I think, of what is happening now is that what has changed is really, like there was the presidency said, let's not talk about it anymore. And there has been a mandate in the newspapers and in the media and to not talk about the violence. I organized a conference in Mexico on violence, inviting people, Ben was there, inviting a lot of people from Latin, and the government was invited too, and they didn't go. And then I asked them, and they said they were said not to go. And then they disseminated this list of, 60 words that cannot be used in the administration. One of them is executions, for example. So what is happening is now, as I told you, this data, we don't longer have it, and now we're not talking about it. But obviously things are still, and so let's say violence is decreasing. We want to analyze whether it's true. Now we don't have the data, no? So I think we can, as I say, we have done work with the death certificates, so we will be able to still continue with this, but it takes time. So I don't have the death certificates now to be able to know what happens in the last year. But, so as I say, I don't have the answer, but clearly, this approach was not the best. Yes?
What about the trade of drugs for guns? So many guns are coming into Mexico from the border. Mexico theoretically has a law that does not allow possessing guns unless you're a campesino.
Yes.
Could you say something about that?
There is a very excellent, fascinating paper by Andrea Dubé on this issue of guns. And what she does is, the expiration of the assault weapons ban in the US. And she uses, I think it's California, which the expiration dates were different. And she's able to show very cleverly that the expiration, it's correlated with very significant increases in violence in Mexico, as, leveraging on this, distinction between two states. So obviously there is huge impact there. I think there is a lot of debate on criminologists, even working on the US, of whether these policies really work. And I really have not followed that, thoroughly, the debate. I know there is debate, and some people say it really doesn't work. But what I can really tell you for sure is that guns are really killing people, obviously. So, and the paper of Andrea really is worth reading, because it all, again, tells you that a lot of what is happening in Mexico is very much correlated with what happens in the US, both in the demand side and in in the issue of supplies of guns. Yes.
Do you have any sense for what the temperature is like for the citizens of Mexico?
Yes.
Is there a tipping point?
Yes.
For, all of those, folks who, go
Yes.
to work every day and are having to
Yes.
deal with this? Do you have a sense for where
Yes.
that might be?
Oh,
Where they
this is
say
a good
basta
way.
and
Yes.
no más? Is any sense for that?
I love this question because I think that clearly at the end of Calderón administration, people were hitting that tipping point. I mean, it was clear that if you go to Mexico, I go very often, and just the pessimism, I mean, everywhere, saying, there is no future, there is really no future. And a lot of people wanting to leave, from all socioeconomic backgrounds, really, really frustration. And I think in part, Peña Nieto's strategy of let's not talk about it and let's just try to create optimism from nowhere. I mean, that's what he really wants to do. I really haven't seen the data, whether that really has created more optimism. People are less focused on violence and maybe, Mexico is growing, no? We are going to be, we're now the new Brazil, no? Is that going to change the mood? I think this is a wonderful question. We have a lot of data that can be used to that. All I tell you is that during the Felipe Calderón administration, he placed a lot of emphasis on public opinion about his drug war, war on drugs, sorry. So it's almost monthly data that you can trace in terms of, opinions about these policies and variation in terms of where you lived. And I think there is a lot to be explored there. What we have done thus far is that whatever, happens, you obviously shift according to your partisanship and so on. But if you are a victim of crime, then no framing matters. I mean, you're really sort of very clear on one side of the story. Yes. Also, the poor behave very differently, and I mentioned the police and the brutalities, obviously because there are more victims of this. But there is so much to explore here, and unfortunately, there is a lot of data that can be used to do that. Yes.
I'm glad that was a wonderful question because unfortunately, it's our last question. I want to thank Beatriz Magaloni for being with us for such a thoughtful, engaging presentation. And I really feel it's the beginning of a broader conversation on these issues and the work that you're doing. I think it makes an incredibly important scholarly contribution, but also a very vital contribution to public policy issues that are so central to what happens in Mexico and the relation of Mexico and the United States.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Which, the expiration dates were different. And she's able to show very cleverly that the expiration, it's correlated with very significant increases in violence in Mexico, as, leveraging on this, distinction between two states. So obviously there is huge impact there. I think there is a lot of debate on criminologists, even working on the US, of whether these policies really work. And I really have not followed that, thoroughly, the debate. I know there is debate, and some people say it really doesn't work. But what I can really tell you for sure is that guns are really killing people, obviously. So, and the paper of Andrila really is worth reading, because it all, again, tells you that a lot of what is happening in Mexico is very much correlated with what happens in the US, both in the demand side and in the issue of supplies of guns. Yes.
Do you have any sense for what the temperature is like for the citizens of Mexico?
Yes.
Is there a tipping point?
Yes.
For, all of those, folks who, go to work every day and are having to deal with this? Do you have a sense for where that might be?
Oh,
where they
this
say
is
basta and no más? Is any sense for that?
I love this question because I think that clearly at the end of Calderón administration, people were hitting that tipping point. I mean, it was clear that if you go to Mexico, I go very often, and just the pessimism, I mean, everywhere, saying, there is no future, there is really no future. And a lot of people wanting to leave, from all socioeconomic backgrounds, really, really frustration. And I think in part, Peña Nieto's strategy of let's not talk about it and let's just try to create optimism from nowhere. I mean, that's what he really wants to do. I really haven't seen the data, whether that really has created more optimism. People are less focused on violence, and maybe, oh, Mexico is growing, no? We are going to be, we're now the new Brazil, no? Is that going to change the mood? I think this is a wonderful question. We have a lot of data that can be used to that. All I tell you is that during the Felipe Calderón administration, he placed a lot of emphasis on public opinion about his drug war, war on drugs, sorry. So it's almost monthly data that you can trace in terms of, opinions about these policies and variation in terms of where you lived. And I think there is a lot to be explored there. What we have done thus far is that whatever, happens, you obviously shift according to your partisanship and so on, but if you are a victim of crime, then no framing matters. I mean, you're really sort of very clear on one side of the story. Yes. Also, the poor behave very differently, and I mentioned the police and the brutalities, obviously because there are more victims of this. But there is so much to explore here, and unfortunately, there is a lot of data that can be used to do that. Yes.
I'm glad that was a wonderful question, because unfortunately, it's our last question. I want to thank Beatriz Magaloni for being with us, for such a thoughtful, engaging presentation. And I really feel it's the beginning of a broader conversation on these issues and the work that you're doing. I think it makes an incredibly important scholarly contribution, but also a very vital contribution to public policy issues that are so central to what happens in Mexico and the relation of Mexico and the United States.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.